Thus we move on to Superman 2. And really to review Superman 2 is to review two different films. One is the film that Richard Donner began to film when he was making Superman the movie, and the other is the film that was completed for release in 1980 with the help of Richard Lester, who had worked with the Salkinds on The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers, their previous effort to make two films together at once. Sadly, these two conflicting directors' visions create a very fragmented release, and it's really hard to get into the film because of this. You have Richard Donner striving for verisimilitude. In fact, if he had stayed on the project, there's very good reason to believe that it would have been a better film than Superman the movie. It had more heart, more meaning. It was deeper. However, Richard Lester took a more comic books are comic approach, more of a Batman, the television series approach. As such, he goes for cheap gags as opposed to the clever wit of Donner's film, and it's all very broad farce. As such, the movie veers from watchable to unwatchable at any given moment. Superman Returns allowed for Superman 2 to be revisited by Richard Donner himself. Thanks to the requests of fans on the internet and elsewhere, there was enough attention brought to the idea of an alternate cut of Superman 2 that was finally decided to let Donner see what he could do. Of course, Richard Donner had not finished the movie, and so he had to rely somewhat on what Richard Lester had filmed, but he was able to use far more of his material than Richard Lester had used. Richard Lester only used a small portion of what Donner had actually filmed, and refilmed much of it to set it a few years later, as opposed to working as a direct sequel, as it was originally supposed to be portrayed. As such, this film is far more cohesive with the original film. In fact, it works as the second half of that film. However, the limitations of this newly put together film are very apparent very quickly. Michael Thau, who is in charge of the editing, just is not on the level of Stuart Baird, the original editor. He's a documentary editor, and it's completely different from, a big budget, epic blockbuster type of editing. And so he more or less botches it at times, to be honest. Also, the effects budget was limited, so the three Kryptonian villains really never get a chance to become more threatening than they were in Richard Lester's portrayal of them, which was very farcical. A lot of the farce was cut out, but there was really no threat that could be put in that wasn't already there. Their threat only raises by the mere fact that the comic stuff is no longer there. Also, one very important scene had to be represented through a screen test, and although this screen test is probably one of the most impressive screen tests you can see in terms of being able to work with the film that it was attached to, it's still apparent if you have a very close eye. Even so, the Christopher Reeve, Margot Kidder chemistry is already there even in the screen test, and it really sells the scene, so the emotionality is there, and it's actually a more compelling scene than the one that Richard Lester filmed to replace it, which was hokey, contrived, and really showed how Margot Kidder was really not into the reshoots. In fact, she was very, very unhappy about how the Salkinds had decided to fire Richard Donner because of conflicts they'd had with them after the success of the release of the first film. In fact, it's these same conflicts that led to the lack of participation of Gene Hackman in the reshoots. And it's very apparent in the theatrical version when you see that he's been replaced by a double. Here you get more of the original Gene Hackman performance, which is excellent. And most importantly, you get, instead of Susanna York, who is substituted to save money in Superman 2, you get the original filmed material of Marlon Brando in his performance, which links the two films together much better. And the story of the father-son relationship is much, much stronger and makes a great narrative that would have been even greater if it weren't for the fragmented nature of both versions of Superman 2. Even so, I would recommend the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2 as a cinematic curiosity. Meanwhile, I would avoid Superman 2, the theatrical cut, like the plague. Welcome to another MAPSA course. I'm film critic May Moreno, and I'm here to tell you that we can learn something from Superman 2. You see, Clark Kent was perfectly willing to give up his other self, his original heritage of Kryptonian history in order to be with Lois. And that really tells us something about relationships, don't you think? Should you be giving up what you are in order to be in a relationship, or will the right woman understand that what's part of you is essential and won't try to change you? Why are we always trying to change each other anyway? Maybe what we need to do is try to understand and love everything about each other, and then we'll be able to make the sacrifices and the decisions we need to have a suitable relationship. And of course, don't ever tell your spouse to kneel before Zod. Bad idea.